I think there is a concern that if we go with these sort of vote counting systems that people aren't used to, that it's easier to make that claim than the election is rigged. When a candidate that was in second place on the first round all of a sudden is in first place on the second round, that voters may not understand that or care to understand that. They're just going to say that the election is rigged.
Hi, thanks and welcome back to another episode of Flower and Power. My name is John Hagner. I'm a political operative who's been working in the field for 20 years, and along with Dr. Seth Maskett, we are trying to understand American politics and also provide some baking tips along the way. We're really excited today to dive into a really interesting topic about the ways that we select our nominees. We're taking a little bit of a step back from the news of the day and looking at the bigger picture of how the systems that make American politics work. And I think some people may not be aware that there's a huge range of ways in which the nominees are chosen from our major parties. Often we do it through a primary election, but there's lots of ways that we can do that. Some states have open primaries where anyone can vote. Some states have closed primaries. There's conventions. There's still a couple caucuses running around. We also, some states are innovating and moving beyond a partisan primary into top 2 or top 4 ballot systems, which we'll talk more about. There's a lot of movement. There's a movement happening all across the country right now to change the options that voters are given in hopes that that can improve the political process in the country, whether that's through higher turnout, through less polarization, through candidates who have to worry more about what the broader electorate in their districts or their states worry about. Just this year, we've got proposals are happening in a lot of different states to change the way that we have our elections. In Colorado, there's an effort afoot to move to a top 4 system. That's the system that is currently in place in Alaska, where in the first round, voters are given their choice of a large number of candidates, and the top 4, whether they're Democratic, Republican, or Independent, move on to the general election. We saw in 2022 that system can have a real impact. Alaska elected a Democratic member of Congress in 2022, even knowing it's a fairly conservative state, in part because the Republican vote was divided among multiple candidates in the top 4. Montana is considering something similar, as is Idaho. We also see states that are moving toward ranked choice voting. We see other states that are moving away from it and are trying to ban ranked choice voting. All across the board, there have been a variety of different ways. And we have an incredible guest to help us understand this, to help figure out what is happening in the primary reform movement and what impact it might have. We've got Professor Caitlin Jewett. She's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech. She has published on all sorts of subjects of campaigns and elections, thinking about public opinion, parties, presidential primaries. In 2019, she wrote The Primary Rules, Parties, Voters, and Presidential Nominations that was published by the University of Michigan. Seth, what else should people know about Dr. Jewett?
Well, I would say, Caitlin and I just want to mention, we have written some stuff together. We're in the process of doing some more research. We were also at a conference together in DC a few months ago, put on by a group called Unite America. And we sat at an extremely snarky table of other political scientists who are fairly skeptical of different types of primary reforms. But honestly, it was a fascinating conference in that we got to hear from a lot of there were political scientists and reformers in the room and we got to hear just sort of share ideas about what exactly what kind of results we tend to get from reforms, what our expectations are. But Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll dig in with the first question. When a state considers moving to a more open primary system, so, if it considers allowing independence or considers a move to a top 2 or a top 4 system, what is the motivation? Like, what's sort of the stated reason? Like, what kind of arguments are used by reformers? But also, is there some sort of other message behind there, other motivation behind that? Why do states try to do this?
So generally, reformers couch this movement in the appeal to democratic values, in small d democratic values. More participation, more inclusion, more competition, less extreme candidates, more moderation, right? And so those are their goals. They say that we have a primary problem and that moving towards some of these reforms will help to solve that primary problem. At this conference that we were at in Washington, D.C., we heard from many people that were very concerned that their tax dollars were paying for primary elections in which independents were not allowed to participate, that they were paying for elections that were only open to a small subset of voters. Another major concern is that partisan primaries, especially closed partisan primaries, produce more extreme candidates and contribute to the polarization of the parties. And so reformers generally want to be more inclusive and sort of open up the process. But one thing I want to mention is I think there's a distinction between when a state moves to a more open primary, whether it's reformers pushing that or whether the state and the state parties are pushing that, because I think there's two different motivations there as well.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the things related to this, so I'm here in Colorado where we only changed our primary system just a few years ago, moving to, a functionally, I think, a semi-closed or a semi-open system where independents have a choice which primary they want to vote in. And now we might move to this top four system. One of the major backers of this is a gentleman by the name of Kent Thiry, who's the head of DaVita, which is a kidney dialysis company. He's a pretty eccentric but very well-to-do Coloradan. One of the rumors here is that he's trying to create, the sort of system that he could eventually run for governor in, and is concerned that, the way things are, he would never get nominated by either party. But if you have a more open system, it'd be more open to, basically well-to-do independents. And I don't know if that's a typical pattern we see elsewhere, or if this is too conspiratorial a worldview. I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Right. Well, so I think many of the reformers, the groups out there that are working to this, the ballot initiatives, right, they are really truly committed to small d democracy. They want to open up the process. But we also know that the state parties are concerned with winning and with nominating the types of candidates that they feel best represents their party and can win elections in November. And so I think state parties, if they're pushing for these reforms, they're not going to generally back reforms that they think will hurt their party, hurt their brand, or hurt their chances in November. So I think there's mixed motivations. And when we talk about the movement towards primary reform, it's important to think about what is said to be the motivation and what might actually be some of these underlying motivations that would be nice if they happened as well in some people's perspectives, but they're not going to necessarily talk about.
But it seems like there's a real distinction between these efforts on ballot initiatives where sort of citizens and groups are bringing this to the forefront, and efforts that are happening through the more conventional legislative process. Do you think is that fair?
So certainly in the realm of presidential primaries, which is where I do most of my work, we have seen states move from caucuses to primaries, and that certainly opens up participation. Seth and I have some research together, however, that looks at some of the other motivations for states doing this. Some of it is to just avoid being overwhelmed at caucus locations, or to ensure a certain type of candidate will be more successful. But on the presidential side, at least, states are moving away from caucuses and towards primaries, particularly on the Democratic side, and that certainly opens up the process.
I'm curious, what we see, obviously, like the states that are considering reform this year are not the first ones to do it. And we have some history. California's had a top two system for, I think, a little over a decade now. Washington State has had it for longer. What sort of effects have we seen? Like, are these actually changing politics, or is there not much of an impact?
It seems like there's not much of an impact,
okay.
Or that the impact we do see is very mixed, that some research shows there's a positive impact, but then there's other research that shows there's a negative impact. But we certainly don't have the clear, compelling overwhelming support that these types of reforms are a cure-all and are fixing the problems and making the process more democratic. The California case is interesting because at the same time that it switched to the top two primary, it also engaged in some significant redistricting reform. And so it's hard to parse out there what is because of the top two primary and what's because of the redistricting reform. And that's part of the problem here, is that we don't have enough states doing this. We don't have enough variation. We don't have enough cases over time to really suss out what is happening, right? Alaska certainly was an interesting example, but they've got one election where they operated under the top four primary. And so, some of the findings out of Alaska are interesting, but nothing to necessarily say we know the answer yet.
Yeah. Now, it seems sort of anecdotally that Lisa Murkowski behaves very differently than a lot of her colleagues in the Senate, and that Alaska's different electoral system could be a big part of that, right? That she knows that she can, speak her mind maybe a little bit more freely because there isn't the same power of defeating her in a Republican primary and keeping her off the ballot. Although the time they did defeat her in a Republican primary, she still won anyway, thanks to a lot of Alaskans who wrote her name in. But it will be interesting to see how elected officials do their jobs differently in these new systems. I'll say anecdotally, the effort in California, one of the goals, I think, of the reformers was to open up the process and make it more flexible and to allow more voices. But my experience working on the operative side may be the exact opposite, that the parties are very concerned in California with the idea of getting locked out. That, in a case where, let's say you have a district where the majority of the population is Democratic, but there are 2 Republican candidates and 5 Democratic ones, it's very easy to see how the math could go that 2 Republicans dividing 40% of the vote evenly and 5 Democrats dividing 60% of the vote evenly would mean that 2 Republicans make it to the top 2. And this fear, which is a very well-grounded fear, has really impacted the leadership in both parties, and I think makes them much more likely to get involved in these races than they might have in a more conventional system. That it's the National Democratic Party or the State Democratic Party probably would stay out of a more conventional Democratic primary in a safe seat, and now they're coming in and they're putting their thumb on the scale, which I think is an unintended consequence of a lot of these reforms.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's all of these reforms might help some problems in some situations, but then they can create other problems. For instance, it seems like they may result in more money being spent on campaigns and elections, which certainly is not what most Americans say they want. They want less money spent. We saw turnout go up in the Alaska primary, but then it fell in the general election, right? So it's about balancing these effects in some ways.
So one of my one of my hot nerdy takes on this is that if you think back to parties in the 19th century, okay, we got really nerdy here. One of their major concerns at the time was making sure that they all agreed who the party's nominee was. This is before we had before we had like official state primaries. There were lots of different candidates who sometimes claimed to be like, I am the true nominee of the Democratic Party of Illinois, and another person would say, no, I'm actually the Illinois Democratic Party's nominee. You would have like multiple versions of the same party showing up, and there was always some risk of lots of people claiming to be the party's nominee, splitting the ballot or splitting the vote and throwing the vote to the other side. Once the government gets involved and you start having official state primaries, that problem is alleviated. And in the 20th century, parties could focus on other things like who is the best for our platform, who is the most electable candidate, and those other questions. In many ways, I feel like maybe like embracing top 2 or top 4 is actually moving us back to the 19th century model, where parties need to get involved again in proclaiming who is actually the true nominee of their party before voters get a say there. Does that sound right, or it's too wonky?
No, I think that makes sense. And I think that is something that many political scientists believe might actually be better for parties and for the electoral system is having parties weigh in at the forefront, right before the primary elections, and sort of letting voters know where they stand to give voters a clearer guide, as opposed to doing it sort of after the fact.
No, I think that's a really interesting point that you make about parties needing to get involved earlier. I do think it begs the question of who is the party, right? Do you think of the party as sort of leaders in Sacramento or Washington D.C. who come in and say this is a better candidate, that's a worse candidate, or do you think of the party as the people in California's 41st congressional district who identify as Democrats or who identify as Republicans? Because it seems to me that the party getting involved earlier advantages the sort of insider part of the party at the expense maybe of the primary voters or the people who carry that partisan label.
And I wonder if, sort of as Seth pointed out when we were at this conference, there was academics and then there were reformers. And I think this might have been one of the disconnects, right? That academics, political scientists often think of the party as the elite in the organization, and we sort of understand their role and value it perhaps more than the average American citizen. Whereas these reformers think of themselves as citizens, and some of them members of parties, but think that they are the party or should be the party. And so there's this disconnect in who is the party and what its role should be.
Yeah. Since we're talking about parties, though, I wonder, in your research and the folks that you've talked to, is there a partisan advantage here? Do these systems advantage right now Republicans or Democrats more?
I don't think there's any clear evidence that they support one party more than the other. I think, as you pointed out earlier, John, it really comes down to the number of candidates in the race, the number of candidates on either side of the aisle, and how they split across the party electorate. I do think that there is a belief that these reforms and systems are more advantageous for Democrats, and that certainly has been sort of put out there by some sort of more extreme Republicans, that this system is advantageous for the Democrats. And I think in part that's because it has been implemented in places like California and Maine and in New York City local elections, right? But we also see it in Alaska, which is a much more conservative state. But of course, Peltola's win over Sarah Palin certainly didn't help the case that this is a more balanced system, and sort of gives credence to the idea that Democrats may be advantaged to this from this.
How important is it? I know some of these reforms, particularly the top four model that Alaska has, and then a few other states are considering this year, the second wave of the election. So essentially the November runoff, where the top four vote getters go against each other, that's all tabulated using ranked choice voting. And I'm curious, how important is that aspect of it? Does RCV give us much different outcomes than we might otherwise expect if it were just simply whoever gets the most votes wins the seat?
Generally, the proponents of ranked choice voting says that it doesn't matter that much, right? In something like 4 to 5% of cases, they say you get a winner from ranked choice voting that you wouldn't otherwise get. That would not be the plurality winner. But I don't think we have enough instances of this, that it's been studied thoroughly, that if you say especially in a top four primary case, if you have 3 Democrats and 1 Republican, right? I don't know how that would play out, or 2 and 2, right? That it might just, the numbers playing out might be very different. But it's all going to come down to the ideological position of the candidates, their appeal, and which voters show up, which may be fewer in a general election if we're using this top four system.
And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I know one of the critiques that I've heard of, particularly of ranked choice voting, but also of primary reform more generally, is that it puts a higher burden on voters. The system seems more complicated. There's more choices to make, and there's a critique among people that that lower information voters, that voters who have, it's hard enough to get voters to care about any election sometimes. But if you've got a lot of busy things in your life, deciding who's your third choice and who's your fourth choice, just doesn't come to the top of your list of things to do. And that some of these efforts are, needlessly complicating systems that actually don't make the process fairer or more open. Do you think any of that's legitimate critique, or do you think that's overstated by opponents?
I think that is a legitimate concern. That ranked choice voting is not how most people are used to voting, and that there's already great concern in the United States that elections are rigged and that democratic elections aren't truly democratic. I think there is a concern that if we go with these sort of vote counting systems that people aren't used to, that it's easier to make that claim than the election is rigged. When a candidate that was in second place on the first round all of a sudden is in first place on the second round, that voters may not understand that or care to understand that. They're just going to say that the election is rigged.
I mean, I guess, well, we've had ranked choice voting in a few states and cities in recent years. And I know that one of the concerns is that like turnout might be lower just because there's more of an ask on voters. My impression is it actually hasn't been that bad. Like turnout has been reasonably good for those. I don't know that it's radically changed the sorts of candidates we get, but I don't know. I'm curious what your take on that is.
I've worked on some ranked choice campaigns in Maine, but Maine is an extraordinarily high turnout state in general. So when you look at the turnout rates in Maine before ranked choice and after, there's no obvious difference, but it's a very high information, high turnout state in general. I live in Minneapolis, which elects our mayor through ranked choice voting, and anecdotally, a lot of people here say it does keep down. It has kept turnout down because it confuses folks and it feels a lot like homework, and that's hard. It's hard enough to get voters to care about a local election.
Caitlin, so this is more of a, I guess, kind of a normative question, but like, I still cling to this idea that maybe is just among political scientists that like, a decision over a nominee or a nomination is to be made by members of that party, right? That, when there is a primary, that is, a Democratic primary is a decision that the Democratic Party is making. And that can include Democratic voters or elites or whomever. But that there's something bothersome about people who do not bother to become a member of that party participating in that decision. And that it's actually not really hard to join a party. American parties don't charge dues or anything like that, but that idea runs, headlong into another very common American idea that like, hey, there's a contest going on, I get to participate in it. My tax dollars are paying for it. I should be able to participate. And I'm just sort of curious, like, is this an argument? Am I just beating my head against a wall with this? I've heard, like, I think Justice Scalia was one of the last people to make one of these arguments publicly. He's dead a number of years now. But I'm just curious what your take on all this is. Is this just a kind of a dead idea?
I think it is not dead among the political scientists, right? And I think we
Right.
saw that at the conference we were at, that the political scientists had a very different view that these parties are private organizations who serve to win elections and then govern, and that these parties should have control over how they choose their candidates and who gets a say in who their candidates are. Whereas the reformers in the room were steadfast in their belief that all citizens should get to weigh in on the party's nominees. And there's some research, at least in the presidential primary sphere, about open versus closed states that shows you actually don't get different electoral compositions of the electorate, because in a closed state, more voters register with the party because they have to if they want to participate, right? So some voters are making these choices that if they live in a state where they have to be a member of the party to participate, like New York State, more people will register with the Democratic Party or with the Republican Party versus in a state like Virginia, where you don't need to register by party and you can vote in either primary that you choose. And so I agree with you, Seth. I don't know that our shared beliefs are widely shared, however.
Well, and not to be too comparative here, but I think Seth points out that this is a uniquely American concept, that there's no other industrial democracy that does state-funded primaries, or where that chooses their candidates through this broadly of a democratic way. That it does definitely set us apart, and I don't know that it makes us better. But I think it's an interesting segue. Do you think? I think there's a legitimate argument that people could have about whether strong parties are good or bad. But would you say that these kind of reforms make parties stronger or weaker?
I think they make parties different, right? That they probably on the face weaken parties, but then as you mentioned earlier, John, then you see parties getting involved and sort of in these primaries to make sure that the candidates they think should win, and that there's not too many candidates splitting the vote. The parties are going to find a way to survive under their rules and to maximize to their own benefit under the rules, right? The parties aren't just going to say, oh, well, the electorate wants top 4 nonpartisan primaries. I guess we're done. They're going to find a way to continue to win elections with candidates that they prefer.
Yeah. I think there's some interesting backlash happening, and this is a bit of a discursion from what you've said, but you've mentioned a couple times about how parties, are seeking to nominate the best candidates and to win. But like many things, I think the contemporary Republican Party is an interesting case study on this. That just recently in Texas, there were a number of Republican primaries that were highly contested between sort of more Trump and less Trump candidates. And in a few cases where the less Trump candidate won, what you heard the Republican Party of Texas saying was, oh, it doesn't really count because they got renominated because independents voted in that primary, right? That, this was crossover voters, the people voting for Nikki Haley are Democrats, and therefore we shouldn't allow them to do it. And I do think it's interesting thinking about how, sometimes the party's goal is maximizing the number of wins, but it also seems right now, some of the times the party's goal is more of an ideological or candidates, trying to get candidates who have different sets of beliefs than the electorate might choose.
No, and I think that goes back to who is the party, right? And that we talk about the party and the party's goals, but even among the party elites, there's variation in those goals and preferences.
Yeah, and that, just like economists like to imagine perfectly rational people in the market, political scientists sometimes like to imagine perfectly rational parties, and that is not the world that we live in. Having worked at a lot of irrational parties myself, I can tell you I know that for sure.
One of the few times when I've actually sort of caught voters in a moment of acting like members of a party, attending the Iowa caucuses, the Democratic caucuses in 2020. And I know like caucuses are kind of on their way out, or at least on the Democratic side they are. But the Democratic Iowa caucuses have this very peculiar system of where there's people sort of they have their first round choice, and then like the candidates that are not popular enough, they get dropped, and so their supporters get realigned to other people. And so there's sort of this way in which voters are encouraged to like think about, okay, first, who do you like? And then if that person doesn't work out, who's actually good for the party? So there's thinking both kind of individually and collectively there at the same time. And I think that in some limited situations that works. Now, Iowa is an unusual system in which they get like a lot of political education over a long period of time and how to participate in this thing. And all the candidates are there explaining things to them. You don't get many opportunities like that in a lot of other states and different contests. But for the most part, I don't think I don't get the impression voters are up for that. Of course, I don't know that we necessarily challenge them all that much to make that happen.
Yeah, and with the millions of dollars spent in the Iowa caucus, turnout is still usually, in the low hundreds of thousands.
Right,
And
right.
yeah.
And also, they did not pick Joe Biden, and he became the nominee anyway. So whatever. But of course, we didn't know that for a good week, for a number of other problematic reasons.
This is a total side note, but a few years ago, I was with a group of political operatives that went to Rwanda to do some training of opposition parties. And we sat down with the National Electoral Office, and they were explaining how local elections work. And they were like, oh, this is going to sound so primitive. We're really sorry, but we don't do it on paper. The candidates who want to run stand up, and then people get in line behind them, and you can see who else people are voting for, and you can reallocate, and you can move around. They're sort of explaining this as this, and we're, we get it. That's the Iowa caucus. We've all worked on it. And the person, they're like, wait, really? That's how you, they were like, yeah, it's probably better. We don't brag about that.
I have an app I could sell them. Yeah. Caitlin, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really helpful, and I will probably want to follow up with you as we figure out like which states are actually considering this, and then what happens and what we can expect from the political systems afterward.
Sounds great. I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Sure. You're welcome to stick around for a conversation on baking if you want, but
I have a 6-year-old to take to a swim meet,
okay.
So I'll, you'll just owe me a cupcake next time we see each other. So
you got it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. So that was great. And John, if I may, I have a question for you. I've been doing, since the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of bread baking. I do sourdough. I do a rye bread, a corn rye that I've gotten really into. But I'm curious about, basically, I get different results at different times of the year. And I'm just curious how much of a role temperature plays here. Like, assuming my apartment doesn't fluctuate a ton in terms of temperature, although probably some. I know my oven has a bread proofing setting I can use that puts it at like 95 degrees. I'm curious, like, how important is it having like a 70-degree kitchen versus like an 80-degree kitchen versus something else? Does that affect the yeast? Does that affect lots of other things in this process?
Absolutely. That's the biggest variable on bread baking. And I think one of the things that I think is fun, I started taking bread seriously a couple years before the pandemic, which was nice because then I had a really good starter that I could share with people when they got into it in the pandemic. But different temperatures matter at different stages of the bread making process. A lot of the best bakeries in the world will have a room that's 74 degrees, a room that's 76 degrees, a room that's 85 degrees, because there's different times that you want different temperatures. The organisms that make sourdough happy are at their best when they're about 70 degrees, is my understanding. And anyone who is more of a baking scientist than I, let me know. But that's when you get the most sort of development of sour flavor. So if what your goal is to get the most intense flavor, you want a longer, cooler rise. If you want the fluffiest, sort of least flavored bread, then you want to go a little bit higher in the temperature. I usually do my bulk ferment at about 85 degrees. I've got a proofing box that I use for that, and that's where I sort of have found the sweet spot there. And then, once the loaves are shaped, I usually do a little bit warmer. But temperature and then also humidity, matters a huge amount. One of my favorite things to make, though, are sourdough croissants. And then you really want to proof it at a very low temperature. I proof my croissants at 68 or 70 degrees, and I let them go for 4 or 5 hours because you really don't want them to get too warm or the butter leaks out and you fry them instead of baking them. There's no one temperature that works for all uses.
Wow. Okay. This is a lot to consider. Thank you. I appreciate this.
You can definitely go over the top. And my my partner, God bless him, puts up with bread in very weird places. We just bought a house in part because it has radiators, and we're really excited about rising my loaves on the radiators in the winter. So, you can nerd on it for sure. Have you ever taken your bread's temperature?
Have I taken their temperature?
Yeah, one way that you can really help your bread improve, if you get a thermometer and actually measure the temperature of the dough at different stages. I've got a little notebook that I write down the temperatures at different spots, and then I go and compare how much I liked it. So,
Oh, that's smart. Okay. Yeah, that's the thing. I've baked a lot of bread over the last few years, and I really should be keeping better data on it. And I could just have a much more scientific approach here. So, okay, good tip for the future there.
lots of variables you can play with.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of Power and Flour. We hope to hear from you soon. But until then, stay safe.
All right, thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskin. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.